Fang and to the college and the council for having me. It's always fun to talk China policy and U.S.-China relations. And I really hope after my few minutes of uninterrupted speaking that then we can have a dialogue about these things. There are a lot of very interesting and, in my opinion, unfortunate misunderstandings out there about a lot of what we hear on TV and in the news about China and the United States. It's always good to discuss them, especially with a group like this. So what I'm going to do very briefly is go over, in my opinion, the three biggest myths about the Chinese government, China's economy, and the U.S.-China relationship. Give me one sec. There we go. Okay. Each of these you will have heard repeatedly on the nightly news, in the New York Times, you name it. And each of them is pretty wrong. First is that the Chinese government is a smart, efficient, monolithic entity that can quickly enact policies and reforms. I call this the Tom Friedman view, held by folks like Tom Friedman for the New York Times and a lot of other pundits out there who frequently claim that if only the United States were as efficient as China, we could get things done here. We could get it done very quickly and efficiently. Well, the reality is far different than that. Yes, the Chinese government can implement policy on a fairly rapid scale when everybody agrees. Unfortunately for them, this is not really that often. The reality of the way the Chinese government works is that China has its own internal conflicts and its own domestic political concerns that distort or retard needed reforms. The most prominent economic issue is the need for the Chinese government to maintain political stability through economic growth. What this really means is that the Chinese government, that the Communist Party, essentially has set GDP targets of around 8% per year in order to ensure full domestic employment. What this means is that oftentimes when business cycles occur and the Chinese government should be acting one way, they act another way in order to maintain a somewhat arbitrary GDP target of 8%. Again, this is to maintain a certain stability in the country that they fear would otherwise be lacking. The second concern is that there is pretty significant corruption within the Chinese government, as you know, many large bureaucratic regimes. This is another issue that oftentimes distorts or retards needed reforms. The one that you're probably seeing on the front page of a lot of newspapers right now is the New York Times ran an expose about the finances of Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, finding out that his family was worth over $2.4 billion. Wen is actually a figure in the Chinese political system who was thought to be a champion of the poor and a man of the people. Well, here we find out that Premier Wen has amassed quite a fortune, his family doing so mainly through Wen's political connections. The other story you may have heard about is the former mayor of Chongqing, Bo Xilai. This is actually a fascinating story, would make a really great TV movie. Bo's mistress has been involved in a sordid affair of a potential alleged murder of a British diplomat. Bo has now been expelled from the Chinese Communist Party, and there have been recriminations. These types of events are becoming more common, or at least more public, as Chinese society develops social media, and we hear back-channel stories of Ferrari races on empty highways and so forth. And they're deteriorating not only the public's support for the government, but also good governance. The other important issue in my mind is the disconnect between the Politburo in Beijing and local governments. You see, state and local governments in China are very much invested, or oftentimes invested, in state-owned enterprises and other industries that depend on various forms of economic stimulus, so forth, from the Chinese government. Well, what this means is that when a dictate comes from Beijing to do a certain reform, the local government might simply not play along because they have their own vested financial interests, or they are seeking to maintain a level of development because they're seeking to maintain their own status. So you combine all of these issues, and there are others, and what we see, especially right now in a time of political transition as China is undergoing, is a far less efficient government. And there really is no better example of this than what we're seeing right now in China with respect to its currency. Now, for those of you who have been following the election, I imagine most of us have heard Mitt Romney railing against Chinese currency manipulation, alleging that China undervalues its currency to get an advantage in international trade. Well, the reality is far more complicated. The fact is that reforming China's currency policies is actually very much in China's interests as it moves away from this export-oriented economic system to one that is more focused on domestic consumption and more balanced. But because of these entrenched interests that I've just discussed, particularly in the state-owned sector, the Chinese government is unable to pursue the types of reforms of its monetary policy and its export policy that it knows it needs to do. And we see the Chinese government that's actually trapped a little bit in this difficult position of trying to maintain political stability and maintain order in the domestic and local governance, but at the same time trying to convert to a more domestic consumption-based economic model that is more stable going forward. And this actually brings me to myth number 2, and that is that China has already overtaken or will inevitably overtake the United States as the world's global economic superpower. Now, this I call the American politicians' view. We hear this all the time from our elected leaders, not just the guys running for president. Throughout Congress and the Senate, we hear all the time how we have lost our manufacturing advantage, our innovation advantage to China, and if only we enact policy X, Y, or Z, that can get us back on track and make us number one again. Well, again, this ignores several realities. The truth is that China is actually still relatively poor. I'll throw out a couple numbers for you. The per capita income in China is around $5,000 per year. In fact, that's actually skewed because when you look at, there are super rich in China that are skewing that. It's really more like the average citizen's making about $2,500 a year. Compare that to the United States, where per capita income is $41,000 per year. Per capita financial assets in China. This is what a Chinese individual has in his or her own 401k or whatever they call it there, about $5,000 total. Again, it's a far cry from what we have in the United States, but it goes beyond that. You've heard numbers that China is now the number one manufacturing power in the world. Well, in raw numbers, that is correct. They just surpassed the United States in the last year. But on a per capita basis, so in other words, what, again, each American produces compared to what each Chinese citizen produces, we are 9 to 10 times as productive. In other words, we're producing almost as much with 10 times fewer workers. We have a dynamic, competitive manufacturing basis we'll actually hear about in a little bit, and the idea of China being this global manufacturing juggernaut simply belies some of these underlying data. Another stat you may have heard, that China is cranking out patents and cranking out copyrights in this innovation powerhouse. Well, the reality is a bit different. Yes, in a sheer aggregate number, there are a lot of patents, but the actual patents that are becoming innovative products is far lower. And in fact, in that statistic, the United States once again leads. And really, there's no better example of this type of dynamic than when we look at my iPad or your iPhone, where all of the design, the marketing, and all of the really high-level services, high-paying services, are done here in the United States. Several aspects of high-end manufacturing are done in the United States. Middle-end manufacturing is done in places like Japan and Taiwan and somewhat in China. Where China excels right now is low-end assembly. But the Chinese people are only getting about 5% of that total price of the iPad, whereas the United States is seeing about 35% or more when you do the markup of wherever it's sold. So this paints a much different picture. And the truth is that yes, China is a rising economic power, but there are certain things that, in my opinion, could actually prevent China from overtaking the United States or other Western developed economies. I've already discussed some of those with respect to some of the political issues that they have in China. But there's others. One of the things to understand is how the Chinese government has pushed economic growth in China. And mainly this is done through government-directed lending through state-owned banks and state policy banks. These loans go to industries, some favored, some others deserving. But the main thing to note is that China